Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your participating in the NWHE Accessibility Working Group webinar. Catherine Oleson is our speaker today with a presentation titled Creating Inclusive Classroom Spaces in which Students Thrive. Kathy is the Dean of the Faculty and a Professor of Psychology at Reed College. Kathy joins the Reed faculty in 1995 and was appointed Dean of Faculty in July 2020. She earned a MA and PhD in social psychology from Princeton and a BA in psychology from University of Kansas. From July 2014 and June 2016, she served as the founding director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Reed College. Her current research primarily explores ways to make the college classroom more inclusive, with a particular focus on productive and unproductive discomfort. A book promoting inclusive classroom dynamics in higher education, a research-based pedagogical guide for faculty, was published in fall 2020. Before I hand the mic to Kathy, there are some housekeeping announcements. In the chat, there will be a link to a running transcript for this webinar. We do provide captions in the form of embedded into the Zoom, or you can use the link that will bring up in a separate browser window that provide you the running transcript. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of presentations. Please post any questions you have in the chat. We will be collecting them and discussing your questions during the Q&A sessions. After today's session, we will send you a brief survey. Please fill it out. It helps us for our future webinar programmings. The link will be sent to you in email right after the sessions. And also, we will be recording today's session, and the recording will be posted on our website at nwheat.org. And also, one last thing before I hand it over the mic, we have our slides in a form of PDF posted on our website, nwheat.org. If you would like to follow along, you are welcome to head over to our website and download it. Okay, now without further ado, Kathy, you have the mic.
Thanks, Coot. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Marianne, for inviting me today. I'm really looking forward to engaging with you all. Again, this isn't the best environment in terms of trying to have this. I much prefer that I could kind of see you all at one time. And as you noted, certainly put questions in the chat. I'm actually very open to answering questions as we go along. Again, if there's things that are kind of more clarifying, the tricky thing would be for me to sort of know that somebody has a question at that point, because I probably won't personally be able to do the chat. But certainly if someone wanted to kind of raise hand and try to let me know, I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. But yeah, the plan today is talking about creating inclusive classroom spaces in which students thrive. And as you'd seen in kind of earlier announcements about this, I see us as having kind of three broad learning outcomes today. So to understand kind of the potential diversity of student backgrounds and the psychological needs that they bring to the classroom. As Ku noted, my background is as a social psychologist. So I'm approaching this work as someone who's thinking about the classroom as a space that we're engaging in. And again, that space could be online, that space could be in person, but we have instructors coming into that space. We've got students coming into that space. There's elements of the space that we're involved in, and trying to think about all of those things and how that might play out. So I'll focus a bit on some student qualities, background qualities, and also needs that students bring to the classroom. I'll talk a little bit about some work thinking about misperceptions between faculty expectations and student experiences. And I give just a little bit example of some of the work that I've done in that area. But I think kind of more broadly thinking about a theme that you'll see will come out today throughout the talk is thinking about ways to be more transparent about what we're trying to do in the classroom, so that students from a range of backgrounds, that it's clear to them what the expectations are. And often I think when we're teaching, so for me, my background as a professor, there's often things that I assume are the case, but in fact, that is not how students are experiencing it. So thinking about how to make that more transparent. And then third learning outcome is thinking about ways to support the design of inclusive spaces, including online spaces and in-person spaces. Just trying to make it where I can see my screen better, the pictures. So these are the kind of three things that we'll be focusing on today throughout the talk. So all right, just adjusting my screen. Okay. All right, as a backdrop for thinking about this, I'm using the idea of universal instructional design. So I think my sense is from earlier programming, you've had some work looking at universal design. There's work on universal instructional design, or UID. There's also work on UDL, universal design for learning. I'll come back actually a little bit to that at the end. These are both kind of grew up somewhat separately, but two approaches to thinking about how do we make the classroom one where students from a variety of backgrounds can really thrive in this environment. This idea of universal design for learning is taking information that we know about universal design in general. So universal design was basically came from architecture and thinking about how do we make spaces where everyone can access them. And the basic idea is that if we make a space that works for the folks that may have difficulty accessing it, then that helps everyone. So again, thinking of physical spaces. So if we make curb cuts on the street, someone who's in a wheelchair can easily go over that. We also then learned these things get complicated. If you make curb cuts, someone who's blind may not realize it's the curb. So now we have curb cuts and we have little yellow parts where there's bumpy, it's bumpy, and you can sort of know all the different things. But basically the idea is that if we sort of build something that's useful for someone who may have some challenges there, it's going to be useful for everyone in that environment. So that we have things that are accessible. If someone's in a wheelchair, if you are in crutches, if you are a parent pushing a stroller, all of those things that's made accessible to you. So to think about this in the learning environment, I pulled just a quote thinking about Chickering and Gamson's, and I don't worry about all of the details of this. I just wanted to use this because I think it gives us a background to think about really many of the issues that I'm going to be talking about today. So they note that principles in thinking about providing universal access to learning, one thing is going to be creating welcoming classrooms. And I'll focus on this a few different ways throughout the talk, but really thinking about what are the cues that a student sees in a classroom. So we can think about this in really broad ways. So if you look at the work on welcoming classrooms, there's really basic things like if it's too hot in a classroom, that doesn't feel very welcoming. You can think about physical kind of features of the classroom. Much of the work, though, actually thinks about symbolic cues that we see in classrooms. So there's a lot of work looking at if there's some nice work coming out of University of Washington, for instance, where they look at if you bring research participants into a lab that's a computer science lab, and it's one where it feels very, Star Trek and Big Bang Theory and so forth, versus one that just has waterfalls and nature scenes. Folks that identify as male, they find both of those spaces equally welcoming. They want to pursue computer science just as much in both of those spaces. Those that identify as female, in fact, they are influenced by that, and they do not want to pursue computer science in a space that feels very Star Trek. They're much more likely to say they're going to take more classes in computer science. The nature scenes, that seems very welcoming to them. University of Washington has actually done some redesign on their spaces. I haven't seen these spaces myself, and actually kind of tried to make them where they were much more welcoming and not sort of turning people off based on sort of symbolic cues in that environment. So we'll think about kind of welcoming spaces and what are the cues that we see. Determining the essential components of a course. So deciding what really is necessary for what you're doing. For me as a faculty member, I often do things the same way, and I sort of say, oh, there's a lab report we should write in psychology, but really thinking about ways you could do that what am I essentially trying to do? If the point of the paper is to generalize information from one domain to another domain, maybe I don't need that to be done as a paper. Maybe that's something that could be done verbally. Maybe that's something that people could do in small groups or with a partner. I'm really thinking about what am I trying to accomplish in an essential way that maybe I could do in other ways. Communicating clear expectations. This will be something that I will talk about throughout the talk, really being more transparent in what we're trying to do. This helps especially students who are not that familiar with the college environment. So students that are first generation college students, for instance, as a faculty member, I may look at a paper and say, this is really obvious what this paper is designed to do. But if a student doesn't understand that that's what's being asked of them, how are they going to actually do the work to be able to do the assignment? So really thinking about how to be clear about that. A lot of work that I do kind of in faculty development, thinking about students may not really understand what office hours are, for instance, and being really clear, how does an office hour work? How does that being transparent about what the goals are of that. Providing constructive feedback, I'm not really going to focus on particularly exploring the use of natural supports for learning, including technology. So we think some about that today. Designing teaching methods that consider diverse learning styles, abilities, ways of knowing, previous experiences, and then creating multiple ways for students to demonstrate their knowledge and promoting interaction among and between faculty and students. So kind of, I'll just note the kind of G, the creating multiple ways for students to demonstrate their knowledge. Again, giving something where, the example I said earlier, where I might have kind of a set paper where I tend to do things in one way. For instance, my social psychology class, students learn about persuasion, how, the principles of how does persuasion work. I then have them create advertisements based on the principles they learned in class. So can they take this knowledge and transfer it to a new domain? I've done this the same way for years and years, but realizing my goal is that they can transfer the knowledge. Maybe that's something where they could do the present, maybe they could do it verbally. They could do it in a written way. Maybe they could do it with a partner. So last time I did this assignment, they could do it individually or they could do it with a partner. And for many people, that really changed how they wanted to approach the assignment. It was more meaningful in certain ways. It still got at my essential, what I was trying to do, but I gave them multiple ways to try to show their knowledge in that case. So using this kind of as a backdrop of kind of some of the things that we're trying to accomplish in this classroom, I'm now going to think about what are students bringing to the classroom environment. So a framework that I think is really useful in many environments is self-determination theory. So Ryan and DC, their idea, they're really interested in how do we promote, their goal is really to how do we promote intrinsic motivation? How do we promote students are engaged? And again, this can apply to other environments. I'll focus on higher ed. How do we promote that students are thriving and engaged and really want to do this work? And they suggest that three things that are important are these three basic psychological needs. So competence, autonomy, and belonging. And this will kind of come up in everything that I'm doing. So again, this is another kind of framework, a backdrop. Competence, we want to feel that we're effective and capable of achieving our desired outcome. And again, I'm applying this to the classroom. I think as I work with staff or faculty, these are kind of basic things that we really want in our lives in general to be able to be engaged and motivated. So I need to feel that I'm capable of achieving something. So again, as I noted earlier, if I'm a student approaching a paper for the first time or approaching a classroom discussion, I don't really know how to achieve. I don't know how to have a productive discussion. I don't know how to write a lab report in psychology. We're going to need to scaffold that learning so that they feel competent to be able to know, oh, this is how I do this. Here's a template to how to do this. So really having some, helping people have some competence in that. Second thing, which is related, is that students feel like they have autonomy, that they have a sense of control and choice in this. And so, again, thinking about this, an example, on my syllabi, for instance, I give information about, so thinking about accessibility, I give information about what is the accommodation process at Reed. Here's who you contact. I convey that it's important that you let me know if you have accommodations and so forth. I'm helping people feel competent so they know what they need to do to get accommodations. I'm giving the autonomy. Here's the information. Here's the email of the person to contact, or here's information to contact me. The final thing is this kind of belonging, this genuine connection and relationship with other people. And so again, in all of these environments, lots of research suggests that if you actually feel like you're part of a group, that you feel like you belong, that promotes that you feel more motivated in that context. Even like this example of putting information about accommodations, I will work with you on this. So they're building a connection with me in terms of that relationship of getting them the accommodations that they need for that class. So we'll think about these, and these three ideas will kind of come throughout. When a learner feels that they are competent, that they have a choice and autonomy to do things, and that they feel like they belong, those things really promote the kind of motivation and engagement and accomplishment that we're looking for in higher education environments. All right, another thing I want to bring in, so we've got these needs that students are bringing in. I want to say just a little bit about personal and social identities. So students are coming at this where they are bringing the identities. So these can be a range of things. So looking at me, you could look at the things you can see visually. There are also things that could be concealable. They talk about disclosure of concealable. So you could look at me and have information about my gender. I certainly could tell you my pronouns. If I use she, her, hers pronouns, you could look at me and have some information about my age, probably based on my education, maybe what kind of social class I'm in. But people are coming to these environments with various kinds of identities they have. And those identities have in their lives given them various kinds of status, given them access to resources or other kinds of things. They're also just things that may be valuable in terms of how they approach whatever you're doing in that academic learning situation. A couple things I did want to note that I think are particularly important in higher education. On the slide, I indicate interdependent. Oh, I should say interdependent and independent. So two different things, interdependent versus independent. So self-construals, I can update that. But the idea is that when we go and we have roles, and certainly this varies culturally, it varies by gender, it varies by race, it varies by if you're from the South or the North, a lot of different things might partake the kind of self-construals that you would tend to bring to environments. So let me just think about culture, which is where most of the research has been done. So in the United States, we tend to be a pretty independent, which is not on there, but independent, that we want to be able to do things on our own. We have this idea that give me the information, I want to be able to independently do this. But you also might be from a more interdependent culture, or you might, given your social roles, be more interdependent, where you really want to be in relationship with other people. And for me, this plays out in really important ways in higher education, because I think often, and again, at a place like Reed and probably many places that you all are at, we really stress the independent. You get to go to college, you get to write your own ticket, you get to do this thing and be your own person. And there's a lot of really interesting work by Nicole Stevens and others, where she looks at like social class. So individuals from lower socioeconomic classes that often are more interdependent. And when they get a message that says you're going to go to college and you get to do whatever you want, that actually doesn't sound very welcoming. That sort of sounds like I came from a situation where I was actually really embedded in my family, and I'm going to college because I am doing this for a lot of reasons. And some of those reasons are that I want to be able to come home and be able to take care of my family and to help out my grandmother and all of these kinds of things. And so what that narrative is, what are those messages that we give people about this environment, higher education, really determines how they work in that environment. So if someone is getting this independent message and they're much more interdependent, they don't feel like this is the place that they want to be. They don't feel like they're going to do well in this environment. And actually, again, you can see less persistent in those kinds of things. So really thinking about what is the messaging that we're trying to do in these cases. Final thing I wanted to note about identities was just to say a little bit about concealable social identities. So people bring things to environments, and these are not things that you can see. So looking at me or seeing me in this little box, there's things that you don't know about me. You don't know if I have, have a disability. You don't know if I maybe have mental health issues. You don't know if I, you know what my sexual orientation is. There's lots of things that you don't know by looking at me, and that you wouldn't know unless I told you something about that. And so again, the other thing I think in thinking about these environments is how do we appropriately give students access to be able to conceal things that would be helpful for them to be able to thrive in this environment. There's times where they don't need to disclose them and they don't want to disclose them. I don't think it's you're trying to sort of get people to disclose things that they don't want to disclose. But I think most particular would be the idea of how do you get students to talk about if accommodations, for instance, would be helpful in an academic environment. If students don't seek out accommodations, they won't get accommodations. So they need to be able to disclose that. It needs to be done in a way that it's not stigmatizing, that they feel like they're actually going to get help from that rather than being treated in a negative way because of that disclosure. I had some research with a thesis students over the years, and actually there's ways that disclosure, if it's done in helpful ways, the student, for instance, was actually very involved at Reed and looking at how do students with disabilities help other students with disabilities, and actually being able to disclose that, it opened up lots of resources for them, both academically, but also socially. And so if there's ways that can be done, I think that can be really supportive of students. Just wanted to note, kind of, it'll come up later when I talk about stereotype threat, but this idea of identity contingencies. So as Claude Steele notes, the things that you have to deal with in a situation because you have a given social identity. And a social identity, that it's social just means that it's based on kind of a group identity. Because you're old, young, gay, a white male, a woman, Black, Latino, politically conservative or liberal, diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a cancer patient, and so on. So this idea that when we come into environments, the identities that we have, what we can do and achieve in that may feel contingent on that identity. Just want to note they could be obvious, they could be more subtle. Claude Steele, in his work, again, I'll talk about stereotype threat in a few minutes. He talks about these, the identities that he often looks at race or gender, for instance, but even just things, he gave a talk at Reed a number of years ago, and he is now an older Black man, and he talks about going with a former student to check out the bike shop that he worked at. So the student, he went to kind of look at this thing, and he walked in and he said, "This is not a place for old Black men. This is where hip, young, white guys work." Sort of those things that, like, he sort of felt like what he could do in that environment was contingent, like the way it was set up, it didn't look like something that really was going to accommodate who he was from his identity. And he also gives more other kinds of distressing things about, as a kid growing up as a Black man, he was not able to swim on certain days at the pool because access to the pool was contingent on what his identity was. So you can imagine a variety of ways that might play out. So thinking about students' concerns and their identities, I'm going to just talk briefly about 4 of these. And self-doubt about ability, belongingness, uncertainty, imposter feelings, and stereotype threat. And again, I'll just kind of make a note of each of these. One thing I want to note on all of these, a lot of the things that students are feeling, are experiencing, are these feelings of uncertainty, doubt. So it's not that they know that the self-doubt about ability doesn't mean that they think that they're terrible. They're worried that they're not very good, or they don't know that they don't belong, but they're uncertain about whether they belong. And so a lot of these things, given that it's uncertainty, those things can be pretty malleable. We could change them up in ways that might be more supportive of students. So self-doubt about ability. Some of my work, I've looked at self-doubt about ability. So it's the idea, just, do I have what it takes to be successful? Am I able to avoid failure? You're questioning that. Am I competent in this area? So if you look at students that have doubts about their ability in academic environments, research suggests they often do things to try to deal with that self-doubt. So there's some work on self-handicapping, which I won't go into a lot today, but the idea there is that, let's say I'm not sure how well I'm going to do. I might actually build in an excuse so that if I don't do very well, people can't blame it on that I'm not smart. So if I got a big test tomorrow and I don't study for it, it's not because I'm not smart that I didn't do well, it's because I didn't study for that thing. So you may want to protect your ability if you have doubts about it. Belongingness uncertainty. Gray Walton and Jeff Cohen have looked at things like, if you feel like you don't belong, then you don't want to be doing that anymore. So they know, and among socially stigmatized individuals, this question may be revisited and revisited. Stigmatization can create a global uncertainty about the quality of one's social bonds in academic and professional domains. So the idea here is, if you feel like you don't belong somewhere, they find that predicts persistence. It predicts things like academic achievement and so forth. Because if you look around and the environment isn't one that has people like you in it, then maybe you shouldn't be in that environment. And so thinking about how we create environments that are more supportive of a range of identities. Imposter feelings, or some people call it imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. You could just have feelings that you don't deserve your accomplishments. I certainly see students that come in, new academic advisees, and they're kind of worried, why did I get into this college? Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe I got lucky, or just happened to know the right person at the right time. When students feel like imposters, that really stymies what they're able to do. The classic work on this by Pauline Clance was looking at women in academics. Much more the recent work is looking at African-American students and looking at how they feel like, well, maybe I only got here because somebody gave me a break, but it's not really because I have what it takes. And if you feel that way, you're not going to do very well. That becomes an obstacle to being able to achieve in that context. Final thing that I alluded to earlier is this idea of stereotype threat. It's the pressure that people feel when they fear that their performance could confirm a negative stereotype about their group. It gives you anxiety, and then that anxiety is debilitating and affects your performance. To be honest, you don't have to believe the stereotype is true. You just have to believe that somebody else believes it. So if you're in a context and you care about that, so I'm a student, I'm in academics, and I'm worried that people don't think that women are very good at math. And that's what I'm worrying about as I'm taking that test. I'm not just taking the test, I'm also having to deal with those concerns that I'm having. My performance is going to be disabled in that context. So a few things about faculty-student misperceptions. I'll just give kind of one example, and I'm happy to talk about more kinds of things with this. The idea here is, I've done a lot of work where I've looked at faculty and students, and I have them say, what do you think about something? What do you think the typical faculty member thinks about it? What do you think the typical student thinks about it? And what I've been interested in is, we often have these ideas about what groups think. And actually, the things I've been looking at recently, I've been looking at how people think about challenge and discomfort and safety in the classroom. And there's a large narrative out there that I'm sure that many of you are familiar with, where this kind of the coddling of the American mind, that faculty are very hard-nosed. All they want is students to be rigorous and so forth. And that students, they want to be coddled. They want a classroom to be totally safe. They don't want to take any risks. And if you ask faculty and students, what do you think? So they for themselves, what do you think that typical faculty member and student thinks? Their perceptions are that these groups are very different from each other. That faculty care about making the class really difficult, and students care about having safety in that classroom. That's their perception. But if you actually ask them what they think about discomfort and challenge and safety across many studies, again, there's some nuances in it, they actually often do not differ very much in terms of their perceptions. Faculty and students both think that discomfort can be helpful. They both think that challenge can be helpful. They both think that safety can be helpful. They can have these ideas, but yet they perceive, both groups have this misperception, but then if you actually talk about it, you realize there's much more commonality. There are something, and I think this actually has big implications, next slide, big implications about how you approach what's happening in the classroom. So if I'm a professor and I think that students want certain things, maybe wrongly so, I could be changing things to fit something that is wrong. I could also be saying, I could have some negative impression. Students are really, this really bothers me that all they care about is safety. They don't want to actually push themselves very hard. I have this negative feeling about that, which in fact is not based on actual information. That could influence how I approach that context. Again, I'm happy to talk about more of this in the question and answers. I just note that briefly, what I really promote with faculty that I work with is being really clear, what are the norms in the class? What are the expectations? On the first day, ask people anonymously to say, how do you think this class should work? What should be the norms in our classroom? What should be the guidelines? And by having that, and then I talk about it the next day, and sort of we get all the information out there. We have a lot of transparency about it. Here's some things that everybody was talking about, and people realize, oh, I thought it was something different. I didn't know what people actually thought about that. Doing it maybe in a way that's anonymous so that they what often happens when we talk about norms is the norms are already in place and the really confident students are already sharing what they think. And so the less confident students may not be doing that. But I think we really need to get out of our assumptions about what people believe and really ask people what they think in ways that they're able to be honest. I have a colleague at Reed that uses these little minty little survey questions and just have people, you can anonymously do stuff. They can just do it on a device and then you get answers. And for me, I always learn a lot because it's not what I necessarily thought was going to be the case. Want to end by saying a few things about the learning environment. So the idea is that we want to design spaces that students can thrive in, that they feel, as I noted earlier, they feel like they can be competent in that. They feel like they have autonomy to navigate that space. They feel like they belong in that space. So there's things that you could do structurally. I mean, I actually have some data. I didn't end up pulling it out. I was couldn't get looking at how people thought about the online environment. And when we moved to being more online, for instance, I think faculty actually felt like, oh, I know what I'm doing. And students felt like, and they actually thought this is going well. And students were like, I don't think this is going so well. So like, I think there was actually some disconnect about that. But actually, if faculty could have said, here's how you need to do these things. Here's how to like kind of giving people kind of a way that they sort of structure what that space is and how to engage with that. It would have given students cues and the kind of resources to be able to do that. I noted symbolic spaces, kind of, yeah, do you have a Star Trek-y kind of environment that maybe turns off certain folks? Do you have, there's research on if you have Christmas trees, for instance, and people are not religious or are not Christian, that they don't feel like they belong as well. Actually, you see some deficits on students' achievement, or if you have various kinds of cues about Native American mascots. And so there's lots of different cues that can be subtle, I said, or noticeable, but really thinking intentionally about what kind of environment one's trying to create and being transparent about what those goals are. Wanted to say just a little bit, and again, I've got a lot of information here, but just thinking about universal design for learning, that basically, how do we meet these needs in this environment? Offering multiple ways for people to engage with the material so that we have a transcript here that people can engage with having that. And basically, I think all the research suggests that if we can close caption, we can have information and everything, that's better for everybody. Some people, they really maybe need that more than other people, but everybody's being having value in that. So offering multiple ways that they can sort of engage with the material so they can sort of see it in different ways. There's things that you could read, there's things that you could write, there's things that you can look at, things you can read. So presenting the course context, I guess maybe using a variety of methods in terms of what we representation, the kind of engaging that they can engage with in a variety of ways, and also including various ways for people to express that. The example I gave earlier, where could they do it verbally? Could they do a written paper? Could they do it with a partner? Could they do it individually? How do they demonstrate what they know? Are there ways that sort of support people from a variety of different backgrounds and needs? Final, just a couple things, sort of thinking about inclusive content, making the materials inclusive. So I've talked mostly, I think, kind of thinking more about some of these pedagogy kinds of things, but even thinking about what people are accessing. I'll just give an example from psychology, for instance. If you have a very self-selected sort of who's represented in those materials, first of all, it's not as accurate. They're missing out on certain perspectives. So really having multiple perspectives. But as you can imagine, when you see yourself in those materials, it's more meaningful, it's more rewarding. Students remember things more if they sort of see themselves in what they're seeing. So really having that inclusive content affects students thriving. Using inclusive instructional methods, having things that are collaborative. So doing work in small groups and thinking about that. And I can answer questions about some of the best practices in that. Having high impact practices. So high impact practices are things like getting students involved in research, or having collaborative work as a high impact practice. So having them study abroad or doing these kinds of things. So really trying to have inclusive things that matter, these kind of high impact practices often have the most bang for the buck for students that are underrepresented, that they really are impactful for those students to engage with the material. I have some references there, and I am going to stop my sharing and end my show. I can and I'm happy to come back to that, but I do want to give us plenty of time to answer questions about any of the material. So I'm now back where I can see everyone's face. So certainly folks are welcome to not have their video on, but if I would encourage you to turn on your video, if that would be of help to you. And I know they've been collecting some questions in the chat, but I'm also, so maybe we'll start with some of those, but I'm also just happy to answer questions that came up as I was talking about this. So yeah, just trying to give you kind of a broad sense of thinking about some of the things that students bring to classrooms in terms of their needs, their backgrounds, thinking about how do we sort of maybe reduce some of the misperceptions that various actors might have in that environment, and then really thinking about what that environment is in terms of ways to make that welcoming and supportive of students feeling like they have the competence and the autonomy to be able to interact in that environment. So I will open it up for questions.
All right. I have some previously collected questions, so I'll read it over to you, and anyone else have additional questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. And the first question is, could you expand on ways that we could facilitate productive disclosures, for example, of accommodation needs?
You're saying productive disclosure of accommodation needs?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think there's I guess a few things I would note. I mean, I think, so, and I probably people at different places, they have different ways they approach, that it plays out at your college. But for me, for instance, I get information that someone has an accommodation. So the idea is that they're going to come to me and sort of talk about that accommodation. What I do to kind of facilitate that, I send them an email that sort of says, I'm happy to work with you on this, and sort of getting like, it's clear, like this is something that we should be talking about. This is something that we're open about. Certainly there are, again, this is actually a silly example, but I was thinking, we have all kinds of things where we want to make sure that students' privacy is protected, that they do not have to disclose something that they don't want to disclose. And it's interesting, I had a student, for instance, come up to me after class and they said, oh, I wanted to talk to you about my accommodations. And so they're kind of there, students are still milling around, and I'm kind of like shuttling them to my office, like, this is a secret thing and we can't talk about it. They came up to me, they wanted to talk about their accommodations, and for me to shuttle them off to my office as if they're not allowed to talk about it in that space, when I'm not allowed to out them. They're allowed to, this is their information. They're allowed to do what they want to do. And so for me to actually just say, yeah, let's walk down the hall and kind of talk about this and come to my office. And just to be clear that I'm interested, I'm engaging with that. This is not something that needs to be hidden. If they don't want to hide this, this is their stuff. And I think there are lots of things that we sort of, I think many of us are kind of uncomfortable with that, trying to protect it, which is a great value. And I think we should do that, but also realizing that students are going to come at it in their own ways. And I had a student, for instance, and she would just in class say, I have this disability. And I think she felt very comfortable doing that. And for me to say, yeah, oh yeah, I should have, I forgot to make the handouts beforehand. Thank you. Here are the, Jack, can you read it for, kind of, here's the thing. So I think conveying that you're comfortable with this, and this is just a part of something that's important to them, and that you want to be able to support them in that, I think can go a long way. I think having clear information about on syllabi and everything about here's how it works, so that they understand what the process is, so they feel comfortable disclosing in that sense. I think anything to kind of, to make it where it's clear how to do that, that you're open to that. At Reed, we have often students have things where they actually have student organizations where students actually work with other students about disability stuff, and to sort of promote that as we have all kinds of identities and students are helping other students. So I think anything that can normalize this in terms of if they want to disclose that. And again, at the same time, I should be really clear, if someone did not want to disclose that, that is their right, and that I'm not, but reducing the bar. So if any way that's helping them to be able to do that. And I think also, even when if someone comes to me to talk about disability and here's how to accommodate it in class, for me to say, to reach out to our disability support services and say, I'm not quite sure how to do this, and to say to the student, I'm getting more information. So again, that it's really clear that you're motivated to try to work with them on that, so that I think sometimes students might disclose something and then actually feel like they're not very supported in it. So that's going to make them not want to disclose it in the future. So actually clearly conveying that you're supporting that in any way that you can, I think will also help them in the future to be able to disclose that information.
All right. The next question is, could you tell me more about how to facilitate transparency about norms, expectations, and values, especially when someone learning challenges might not be visible?
So say, I didn't quite catch the end, Kuhn. Yeah.
Could you tell us more about how to facilitate transparency about norms, expectations, and values, especially when some learning challenges might not be visible?
Yeah, I'm trying to think how the lack of visibility may play into that. And if someone wanted to further that question, I mean, for me, I actually, again, I'm partly a social psychologist. We study norms. So I'm just like, this is what I do in classes. I'm like, you're going to use norms in this class. This is what we're going to be talking about in this class. But I often, again, on the first day, really just try to say, I have things that are set up on the syllabus of kind of expectations that I have myself. To be honest, norms work the best when they're actually mutually agreed upon by the various people in that group. So I often will just say, I think, as I noted earlier, I typically have students in person. They just would write down things that they said on a piece of paper. I would just collect them all. I'd come back the next day and I'd sort of present the information. But I'd sort of say, what do you think would make a good conference discussion, seminar discussion here? And so I would get information they had about norms, what's worked well in other classes. But anything that you can get kind of the quiet voices to convey that information. So certainly, again, using something like a anonymous thing where they can sort of put in information. So you have that, so you can sort of say, here are some norms. And then I think, many people, I actually don't generally do this myself, but some people come up with like a contract of here's how this class is going to work. So you could sort of like have some way that you sort of solidify that. The other thing is, I think, being able to come back to those later on. So if something comes up, and so for instance, in my classes, I teach a class on stereotyping and prejudice. So how do we talk about these things? So it's really hard to talk about race, and we have norms about how to do that, and being respectful, and giving people space, and talking about ideas, and not making personal comments. And so we have all these different norms that we might set up. And then 3 weeks in, something happens and you say, okay, let's go back to our norms. And maybe this didn't play out the way that we had planned. And I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I guess I was interested in how kind of the learning challenges might play into that. I guess I was wanting to just maybe understand more, because I don't know if I'm fully answering that part of the question. I don't know if.
Marianne here. I was just thinking about, this interaction between visible and invisible facets of identity.
Right.
And also this desire for transparency, and how, that could get kind of complicated. And so lots of learning challenges might not be visible. That could be mental health, it could be accessibility, it could be cultural stuff that you just don't know. And so I was just trying to think about sort of practical ways to navigate that.
Yeah, and that's a great question, because I do think, I don't think you want, I don't think you want to put the onus on a student that they have to disclose things that they don't want to disclose, or even as a faculty member. I mean, I work with faculty and they're sort of like, I'm teaching this class and it's about politics. Should I talk about my personal politics? Like, is that appropriate to disclose or not appropriate to disclose? And I can't really tell them what they should do about that, but I can sort of help them play through what are the pros and cons of doing that and how that might change what they're trying to do in the class. But I think there's things where you want to make it where someone could convey some information, kind of maybe even privately or in that context. But I think the other thing, kind of Marianne's point brings home to me, is you also just kind of the universal design idea. You want to build things in so that they also don't have to disclose. So if there's something, so for instance, when I'm teaching, let's say someone has an accommodation where sometimes something happens in class and they're going to need to leave the class. So, and again, this could be something, maybe anxiety. It could be, I had a student a number of years ago who had an insulin, something for their diabetes. So they might have to leave the class because this starts beeping or something happens. And so there's these things that there might be accommodations for in terms of needing to leave the class. And I probably need to come up with some norms for the class that it's okay to leave the class. Like if someone has to raise their hand and say, my monitor is beeping right now to be able to leave the class, they don't need to disclose that in the class. I know about it beforehand so that I can make sure that they are accommodated. But I need to set it up and say, if you need to go to the bathroom or if something comes up, you are free to leave the class. If you need to, I have students that will say, I might need to leave today for some particular kinds of thing. I'll say, why don't you maybe sit close to the door today so it's not very disruptive. And so they're kind of thinking about making the environment so that they don't have to disclose too, so that everybody feels like it's okay if I need to leave the room for a moment because maybe I'm upset by the conversation, or maybe it's just because I have to go to the bathroom, or whoa, it beeped and I'm expecting my mom's in the hospital. I need to be able to go check and see what's going on with that phone call. So I do think building in so that you've prevented them having to disclose in some ways, I think is also kind of making that inclusive, but also really thinking about, based on those maybe disclosures that you have, what are ways to build it in? Okay. If you have a long class and some of those things might happen, maybe you just build in a little break in the middle of class so that everyone has a moment. If someone says, oh, I have a physical disorder that I might need to run to the bathroom, and it's like, okay, just make sure I build it in so that they will always have a chance in the middle of that long class to be able to take a break there. So, but I do think, I think there is a fine line between being supportive so that people could disclose things versus really making that where they sort of feel like they need to disclose that. And again, I think that would be problematic. I think the other thing, just that, but I'm thinking about with the concealable, and I think there's a tension. I always really think about kind of trying to take into account people's different social identities, but there's also a tension there of sort of responding to that and keeping that as part of it, but also being too aware of those things. There's all the things we know about stereotype and prejudice and whatever. So it's sort of that kind of, how are you respectful of things with also not like having those identities play out in ways that are problematic, or that those people feel like they've been put on the spot, or that there's stigma associated with those.
All right. Here's another questions in the chat. From Nelson, I'm wondering if you could talk more about ways to get feedbacks from students about their sense of inclusion in a classroom or a class.
Yeah, that's a great question. I for one actually think as much feedback as you can get, anonymous feedback you can get from students in various ways, can be really helpful. So kind of inclusion in particular, you might need to think about how you want to word that. But for instance, we have a program at Reed where we have student consultants that come in and get midterm feedback and ask the students anonymously what things are working well, what things are working poorly. You can ask any kind of questions that you want. They give that feedback to the professor. Even if you didn't have a student that could come in and kind of do that anonymously, you could just have something where you give people a time to provide anonymous feedback. And you could ask in particular about inclusion if you wanted. I think Brookfield has this stuff where he kind of just, I could send the information, but he has kind of a series of just a brief questions that he has students ask. And sometimes he's an education professor, and I think he does it just at the end of every class. It was sort of like, what's something good that happened today, something that's bad that happened today, something that was maybe surprising that happened today, or, just something you could kind of have these questions that come up in class. And I do think, the inclusion to get at a more general thing that might, I don't know if these would really get at it, but let's say there was a day, let's say in my social psychology class, if we were talking about racism or something like that and prejudice, and some students felt uncomfortable, they didn't feel included that day because of that conversation. If at the end of class they sort of said, what was something that went well, something that went poorly, what was something that was surprising, they might have said, I really felt a lot of tension about this topic, and I felt like sometimes you've got dynamics where, again, I'm often in environments that mostly people that are white, and if there's someone like you're talking about race, and then everyone kind of is looking at the Black student in class, and so they're like, I didn't feel very included because I felt like people were looking at me. Maybe they were looking because they thought you would have a good idea, but you still feel like the spotlight is on you in a really uncomfortable way. And so I think for me, I guess the kind of how do you get information about how people feel about inclusion, I actually just try to ask students and get feedback about things. I think is really a helpful way to do that. I think as much as possible, again, going back to this idea of disclosure that we talked about earlier, I don't think that instructors need to be being overly disclosing about things, and they need to decide about what they want to disclose in that environment. But I also try to model to students ways that I myself might not feel, just the first day of class, I always have students go around to learn, what's something you have in common, what you think you have in common with everybody in this class, something you think is different from everybody in the class, maybe something you're not sure about. And so, and I always say, don't share anything that you don't want everybody to know, because your partner's going to tell everybody in the class about this. But really kind of modeling that I usually will say, and then there's one thing you're not sure. Do other people feel this way? Do other people not feel this way? Usually for that last one, I say, I always get really nervous the first day of class. I've been doing this forever. I've never not been in school. You never took a break. But like every day, the first day of class, like, what if people don't like me, or what, they sort of say something that just gets a little laugh, but like that kind of feeling like even a professor doesn't know if they're going to fit in that class. And again, you can be done in a very low stress way. It's not me telling my deepest, darkest secrets or what I would tell my therapist or whatever, but just something that's sort of like we're all kind of in this, and the first day maybe feels a little uncertain and you don't know what's happening there. And then I can say, I'm one of 11 kids. I can sort of say something like, but no one can beat that or whatever. So you can they'll be like, oh, I don't look at this person and know that they have this thing that's probably pretty different than other people. And so I think as much as in kind of low stakes ways, modeling that it's okay to talk about if you didn't feel included or whatever, I think also can be helpful for students to kind of realize, oh, Kathy said this thing in class. I could go to her afterwards and say, yeah, in my social psych class, for instance, they had to do something nonconformist one day. So they had to do something, and students are coming to class in silly outfits or whatever. But some of them actually, they get it a harder thing where they did something that was nonconformist, and a student wore political buttons for conservatives, and other students were mean to them that day when they wore that button, and they wanted to come and talk about that experience of like really feeling excluded because of their sort of conservative political beliefs. And they actually, I don't even know if they believe those things. They were doing it for this nonconformity thing, but it actually played out in a way that was really different from that. So I don't know, giving them opportunities to do that, and they can come by and privately talk about those.
All right. Here's one more questions in the chat. The question in front, Dan, is any advice for applying this as a guest librarian who only meets with a class for one sessions? Like during the non-pandemic time, the class often comes to the library classroom for one session.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I would say a lot of the things I'm thinking about really are, if you're an instructor for a whole semester, like things that you would do to sort of set up norms. And if you just came for one session, you would be like, I can't set up norms and do all those things. So that would take the whole time, and I would not get to actually talk about the material I need to talk about. Yeah, that's a good question. I guess a few things. I think, even that you all had me write learning outcomes, which I had not initially done. And Marianne was like, we have learning outcomes. That and that was great, actually. I think anything that you can do to be like coming as a librarian for one class, like, what are we trying to do today? Like being really transparent about what your goals are. Some students, they get how librarians work and what they might be doing. Other students are going to be like, this is really different from what I experienced before. So being clear about what your goals are, I think that can be really inclusive. So students get what we're doing today. I mean, I think, again, depending if it was a group of 10 students, maybe you'd have everybody just say their name, just kind of like something where they kind of feel like you kind of know who they are a little bit. Actually, I have professors I read where they have little nameplates for just things, or like you could have just students, something where they kind of, you at least kind of know me a little bit. Being really clear about kind of what the goals of the session are. Providing ways that students can easily get back to you afterwards if they had questions about things. And there may be even, again, depending, like this Menti thing, I'd have to look up what the site is, but like basically what it is you can put a question and then you can just, students on their phone, they just do this Menti and they could just, like, the question could be, what questions do you have, whatever the topic, about this thing, and they can just anonymously put their questions up there. I use it, I've used it in like seminars where we're looking at like, how do you talk about race and various kinds of things? And it just gets people to kind of put that information out there. So there may be things where you could have them anonymously ask questions. That also helps you at the beginning to say, so let's say you're like, here's how they're going to do research for these term papers they have for class. And you just having like, what are the questions that you have at this point? So they kind of just get the questions out there. So you could sort of say, I'm going to make sure I try to hit these as we go through this session. So they kind of feel included because I got to put that stuff out there. Or for you to say, these 3 things we're not going to get to today because we only have 45 minutes. I encourage you, ever put these questions in, reach out to me if we don't get to the answers to your questions, so that they know that their questions, even though they weren't covered that day, or things that you're interested in, if you had more time, you'd be able to do. Nelson, I see you have your hand raised. I was gonna, make sure we got to,
Thanks. Yeah, just a quick follow-up question to that ways of getting feedback. I wonder, do you think that there's sufficient value in Likert scales, or these kind of like psychometric tools that assume linearity in responses and whatever else? Or like, if you're looking for feedback on inclusion for students, do you go more for written responses that tend to be more qualitative versus like how do you feel included, 0 to 5 or something?
That's a great question. I mean, I think both can be really valuable. So I was gonna say, most of my own, like the work I was talking about with kind of faculty and student misperceptions, I've done focused interviews with faculty and students and really got have rich kind of description of that. But I also have scales where you're just saying, so even something like how included do you feel in class? I think giving people a space where they could do some qualitative, make some notes. But I think you could also just, on a 1 to 5, not at all to extremely. I mean, I think that's useful feedback to be able to say, 2/3 of the class were under 3. Okay, that's a problem. Again, maybe the specific number isn't going to be so, but just if most people are on the bottom half of feeling included, that seems like a problem. Whereas if you're like, okay, so you're kind of using it in a really general way, I think that can be useful for, the other thing would be, I think having that metric can be really useful if you want to look at how it changes across time in your class. So if you were in some context where well, and even like kind of the example, even just like the one-off kind of library example, it's sort of like how, I don't know if you'd say included, I mean, what that means, but like how, if you want to gauge something about that, that might be useful feedback to then for the next workshop that you're planning to try to address that more. But I also look at it, if you ask people kind of second week, how they're feeling about that, and then you could come back in the 8th week and sort of see if there's any changes about that. So to having some quantitative information, I think can be useful. And again, as you kind of noted, these things are not perfect kind of measures of those, but I think if it's moving around in a big way, you're going to be able to, that's going to help you to be able to kind of, I think, assess that.
Okay.
Yes, sure.
Oh, one more question. I think we only have time for last questions. Could you discuss best practices for small group collaborations?
Yeah, that's a great one. And there's actually a bit of work on that. And again, I could, if anyone's particularly interested, I can certainly point you to some more specific kinds of things. I think there's a number of questions one wants to ask in terms of you have small group collaboration. And, so the questions are that kind of come out in the literature. Do you assign people to groups? Do you have them randomly go into groups? Do you, how do you sort of do that? And so I think for me, the kind of best practices, if you look at the literature, is really, you need to think about what your goals are in that. Are your goals, so in some sense, randomly assigning students to groups, for instance, like small group collaborations, they're going to interact with lots of different people. There's going to be some good things about that. Data suggests students don't like to be randomly assigned to things. They like to have choice, so if you give people choice, there's work suggesting what happens, you choose to hang out with your friends, so that the groups tend not to be very diverse. So in some sense, I think it's, that they often kind of go to similar people that are similar to them if they sort of pick their own groups. And so I would recommend things like in small groups where you maybe have people give some information, and then you kind of assign people based on that information. So they did have some choice in that, but then you kind of can make the groups have some diversity. Like in my classes, you don't want all the seniors in one group. You kind of mix up kind of the years, or you mix up various kinds of things. So I think having that diversity of backgrounds. There's other work looking at small group collaboration of looking at kind of identities. And so I think some of these are really challenging. So I've worked with some faculty thinking about what do you do in kind of science if you have a class that has very few women. When you do the small groups, if you sprinkle like one woman in each of the groups, they tend to feel pretty tokenized because they're the one woman in each of those groups. And so there's some work looking at maybe you do the small group collaboration where you have, make sure that you have at least 2 women in each of those groups. And some groups just don't have any women in them. You just kind of are able to kind of do those things. But again, if someone's interested in that, I could kind of point them to kind of thinking about the different dimensions, like how do you assign people to groups? What do you want the constellation of those groups to be? Are your goals really about just production, like kind of is the collaboration to get production done, or maybe your goals are to be able to have good intergroup contact and those kinds of things. And so there might be different kinds of strategies you would use in those different contexts. There's also work thinking about how big do you make groups. If they're over about a handful of people, it tends to be hard to kind of coordinate people to be able to get the work done because there's schedules are too hard to schedule and those kinds of things. So there's some work looking at group size that could be of interest too.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy, for the wonderful presentations. And I think our time has run a little bit over. And thanks everyone for participating in today's webinar. We will be sending out email surveys. We also have the survey link in the chat. Please help us to fill it out. We will like your feedback. All right, thank you. And I will also post the recordings of the webinar soon after. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.